I brought your paper. I left it in the truck, so I'll get it for you after.
You're a good guy.
Okay. I want to go ahead and get started. Today, we're talking about the Christian colleges and their impact on our restoration movement. It's a long trip down to the end, but there are four distinctive and noticeable impacts that the Christian colleges have had on our restoration movement. At present, we have somewhere between, depending on how one counts it, 13 to 16 or 17 colleges that are associated with Churches of Christ. Trace Hebert is a member of the faculty and administration at Lipscomb. He does some research about all the Christian colleges and publishes that research it's published in the Christian Chronicle, and then they share that all with the presidents of all the institutions. They need to be, in order to fall into his research, they need to be accredited, they need to be degree granting, they need to have graduate programs. There is a small college up in Alaska that doesn't fit into that, but it's associated with us. Southwestern Christian College in Texas is primarily a black institution, African American institution, and they chose not to participate in that. We'll look at some of that research today. I spent my career in higher education, most of it. We have been a believing family in Christian education. My aunt graduated from Abilene Christian. Our daughters graduated from Northeastern Christian and from Lipscomb and from Freed-Hardeman and from Pepperdine. We have taught at, we were in leadership role at Northeastern Christian, about which we'll talk a little bit later. Freed and I met at Freed-Hardeman. We spent most of our careers there. We were on staff at Lipscomb for a while. We're strong believers in Christian education. I'm supposed to be a walking review of the literature about Church of Christ colleges. After I prepared for this program, I don't know anything. And what I'm going to present to you today is primarily from the research of one of our former members here, Doug Foster. He has prepared an encyclopedia of the Stone Campbell movement, which is about this thick, and he has quite a bit of information in there just about the Christian colleges. There was a college associated with our movement in New England all the way back in the 1700s as it was just beginning. Of course, you know that Campbell started Bethany College, but there was a college called Bacon College before that, and we'll cover that on some of our slides. That's after Francis Bacon, not breakfast. So before we do this, I wanted us to take a minute. Well, it'll be a little bit more than that. One of my former students on her Facebook page has a signature at the end of whatever post she makes that says, "Be kinder than necessary. Everybody is struggling with something. Everyone's carrying some kind of a burden." I happen to know that some of our people related here are experiencing difficulties they didn't see coming. Some of my friends, some distant, some here. So I wanted to take a little bit of time to point out about Jesus taking care of the sick. I wanted to read to you the four stanzas of a hymn that's written in the 1800s as our movement was getting started in England. We probably don't know it. It's a beautiful hymn to sing. I wanted to look at a scripture and show you a painting, and then I wanted to have just a special prayer for those who are struggling. So, This is a picture of Jesus. The text, which I'll read next, says that at eventide they brought the sick to Jesus and he healed them. So this is Mark 32, Mark 1, verses 32 through 34. And that evening at sundown, they brought to him all who were sick or oppressed by demons. And the whole city was gathered together at the door. And he healed many who were sick with various diseases and cast out many demons. And he would not permit the demons to speak because they knew him. In our Great Songs of the Church, number 373, I believe it is. This is published by E.L. Jorgensen in the 20s, and then there was another version of it in the 60s. A competing hymnal was Christian Hymns number 1, 2, and 3, published by the Gospel Advocate. Jorgensen's book was published first by Christian Standard, which was, as we're looking through our restoration movement, we noticed two divergent groups, primarily driven by the Civil War. So this poem, this hymn, was written in the 1800s by someone in England. And the first stanza is, even when sun was set, the sick, O Lord, around thee lay. Oh, in what divers pains they met. Oh, with what joy they went away. O Savior Christ, our woes dispel. For some are sick and some are sad. And some have never loved thee well, and some have lost the love they had. And none, O Lord, have perfect rest, for none are wholly free from sin. And they who fain would serve thee best are conscious most of wrong within. Thy touch has still its ancient power. No word from thee can fruitless fall. Here, in this solemn hour, in this solemn evening hour, and in thy mercy, heal us all. Bow with me. Eternal God, we are so thankful for so many good blessings, we cannot even enumerate them. We're thankful for this congregation. We're thankful for our lives. We're thankful for salvation. We're thankful for our leadership. We're thankful for our friends. We're thankful for belonging. Thankful for our health, having lived as long as we have, for those who've gone before, who are mentors for us. Many of our friends are hurting, have news they didn't expect. And we pray your blessings on them and on us as we remember times just like that for us and prepare us for when those times come. Be with us now in this hour, in this room, as we continue to look at our history, at our efforts to return religion and faith to New Testament Christianity, simply stated and simply exercised. We confess our sins. We beg for strength, for stronger faith, and for a peaceful hour in which to pass in this life. In Jesus' name, and amen. So, earliest religious colleges in America all of them were started with a religious background, and I have just a list of those here. John Pope admonished me last time I was here. He said, John, get a bigger font size for your slides, and I've tried to do that, but I didn't make it on this. I have to turn around to read these. Colleges were established to train ministers in theology and sacred languages. Almost all Ivy League schools were established by denominations. Harvard, 1636, its purpose was to train ministers. 1693, the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia, in business to this day. It is a public institution now. It is the premier, it and the University of Virginia vie for top billing. It's one of the better academically strong universities. They still call it the college. St. John's College has two campuses, one in Maryland and the other in Santa Fe, New Mexico. They have no, at this point, religious affiliation, but when they started, they did. Yale College was started in 1701 by the Congregationalists. If you have any reason or have spent any time in New England, you know there are a lot of Congregational churches up there, and virtually every one of those little villages, white building, tall bell tower, it's Norman Rockwell in terms of how you see it. Princeton College was started by the Presbyterians in 1746. Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire was started in 1769 by Eleazar Wheelock. And Vanderbilt was started in 1873 by a gift from Cornelius Vanderbilt, but it was driven by started under the Methodist umbrella. Early Restoration Movement colleges, undergraduate schools, and graduate education associated with the Stone Campbell, we were doing that from the outset. In 1836, Bacon College was started in Georgetown, Kentucky. It was the first cooperative effort to start higher education. In 1840, Alexander Campbell started Bethany College on a farm, his farm at his home. Campbell's educational philosophy was moral excellence was chief end of education. And we'll cover that again at least twice as we go through what we prepared for today. Higher education growth from Bacon and Bethany from the early 1836 to 1840. There were 200, this is within our movement now. This is where, I didn't know any of this stuff before last week. 215 colleges and universities started in that period between those years. 207 institutes and academies. Now, by that we mean high schools, small groups that were generally for elementary and secondary. People over 187 years, more than 1 million people have been educated in colleges and universities related to us. This is a statistic that I found in Doug Foster's work. Higher education is the oldest and largest outreach of the Stone Campbell movement. Doug Foster proposes that it predates any of these other activities that we've talked about in our efforts. The question of higher education control, this is, I'll get to this Dartmouth College case that went to the courts, but in the beginning, colleges and universities were privately controlled. And some of the states began to decide they wanted to take over, and so there was a court case. The Dartmouth College versus Woodward was a dispute over institutional control, and the case was decided that Dartmouth was a private institution responsible to its governing board, the Board of Trustees. So that checked the development of public higher education until after the war between the states, after the Civil War. There was an act after the Civil War that put in place what we call land-grant colleges. Every state has a land-grant college. University of Tennessee is that here. Usually most of them, I think the University of Kentucky wound up being a land-grant college, but it was started by some of our people, or at least a predecessor. So this unleashed an era, this dispute here unleashed an era of church college foundings. So in Jacksonian America, I have a difficult time distinguishing between Jeffersonian, which was early 1800s, and Jackson. So as I was preparing this, I'm doing all this work, and I'm thinking, these dates don't work out. And come on, John, this is Andrew Jackson. He's a guy who walked over in Washington, D.C., put his walking stick down, and he said, I want the Treasury Building right here. And it's just adjacent to where the White House is. These are some of the conditions prevailing during that period of time. So they wanted classical education was languages. At this point in time, they began to want something you could use. The Dirty Jobs guy talks about things that will help you get a paycheck. Vocational, we talk about. And it took our schools a long, long time because of our closed communication circuit when we were developing our institutions. We'll get to that in a little bit. Took us a long time to reach out and understand that the classical education, while worthwhile at the time, wasn't helping people earn a living. So we were a little bit slow to move over along that. So Jacksonian America also provided a strong belief in the value of the individual. There was no confidence in the older institutions. Those state institutions had been around a while. They were drifting from where they were where they had started, and people wanted something else. So Protestant churches drove rapid development of private colleges. Both Jacksonian mindset and the rapid growth of colleges had a strong impact on Stone Campbell movement. So according to Foster, the golden age of college growth in our movement was from 1830 to 1960, development of small rural church colleges. Now, Nelson and I were talking week before last, I think it was, and he said the first time I ever went to Henderson, to Freed Hardeman, one of his sons was playing soccer, and he went down and he's looking around. Now you remember, Nelson is unique in the fact that he always wants to know why. One of the best leadership books I have ever seen is called Start With Why. They use it in War College up around West Point. So Nelson said, he looks around and he says, why would there be a college in this town? Henderson, when it was started, was 1,000 people. Predecessor institution were back in 1869, West Tennessee Christian College, and then Henderson Male and Female Institute, George Robertson Christian College, and finally Freed Hardeman in 1908. Well, these colleges were springing up all over where the Stone Campbell movement was. 6 to 12 professors, 100 to 300 students. 1950, Freed Hardeman had about 250 students. Lipscomb was still a junior college, I think, by that time, but Lipscomb became a senior, had a stronger clientele here, and Lipscomb became a senior college years before some of our other schools did. Lubbock Christian College started in the 50s, and they were a junior college for a long time. Magic Valley Christian College out in Idaho never got out of the junior college, and you know, we'll talk about, a little bit later, we'll talk about demographics up in the Northeast when they started colleges up there, but there just wasn't critical mass to make those things work. So the Baptists, in their enthusiasm, the Baptists declared they were going to have a college in every state, and the Methodists said they were going to have one where there would be every conference. Now, I don't fully understand how the Methodists are organized. I do understand how the Presbyterians are organized. They're organized in presbyteries, and that's a geographic area which they themselves decide. So, educational growth in the 1840s, prior to 1840 in the Stone Campbell movement, there were 11 colleges started prior to 1830, 4 in Indiana, 7 in Kentucky. Remainder was in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. Okay, what you see here with these is most all those except for Virginia were above, they were in the north, above what we would later call the Mason-Dixon line. There were 2 colleges out of this group. The rest were elementary, middle and secondary schools. This is another slide along this same top. Now, the same idea. Now then, we must not discount their importance, because some of them produce national leaders. And it mentions these 3 people right here. And I'm thinking, all right, if Nelson's teaching this class, he's going to ask somebody who those people were. So I looked them up. All of them, the first 2, were people who Wallace wound up being governor of Arizona, I believe it was, and Martin wound up being in the Congress, and Ambrose P. Morgan became an investment banker. This is a long time ago, but all of them became national figures. So, Stone Campbell movement demonstrated leadership in higher education for women. Now, when I was working in Washington for the Council for Advancement and Support of Education, one of my portfolios was to be involved and make sure that Mount Holyoke College, a woman named Celia Goodale was part of our governing board, and she sort of took a liking to my accent, and so I learned quite a bit about Mount Holyoke College, College for Women. It's a premier school. Well, it was started 5 years after our Stone Campbell people started Poplar Hill Academy in 1831 in Kentucky. So we predated this premier school, world globally known, by 5 years. Virtually every Stone Campbell institution was co-ed or female. Most all these colleges and universities I showed you at the beginning, who are now Ivy League schools, were, at the time, men only. Okay, I could not get this slide to work. I had to push this button 7 times to get it to move. Building new colleges within the movement was focused on building faith, commitment to learning, and social purpose. While Campbell started Buffalo Seminary in his home in 1818, he had it tough with that. He soon discontinued that, and his writings in the Millennial Harbinger was he was reluctant to start colleges, and Doug Foster proposes that was because he had a bad experience with the school, with the seminary he had in his home. So until 1840, new colleges were found without Campbell's involvement. But nevertheless, Campbell was busy developing an educational philosophy that would shape the foundation of educational institutions within the movement for the remainder of the century and beyond, even to this day. So Campbell's educational philosophy, and we talked about this earlier, he studied prevailing education through organizational educations, what was prevailing in the country. He studied the works of Bacon and Locke. There were a couple of others who were major thought influencers whose work is not referenced in any of his efforts. Now, pay attention here. Campbell reached outside to find out what prevailing actions were being done in American higher education. When our colleges began to grow in the early part of the last century, of the 1900s, we were pretty closed circuit. We didn't reach out that much to find out what the prevailing activities, what new thoughts were, and that put us behind just a little bit. Okay, so he developed a conservative, conventional, classical view of education. The predominant feature, remember we talked about this at the beginning, the predominant feature of Campbell's ideas was the formation of moral character, culture of the heart is the supreme end of education. With me, education and the formation of moral character are identical expressions. Campbell, this is a quote of Campbell. Okay, he started Bethany College. What he achieved in his college on his farm in 1840 was a blend of Christian ideals and Enlightenment ideals. So Campbell reached out beyond, as we've said. He developed a collegiate curriculum that served the intellectual, moral, vocational, see that? Vocational, religious development of students, and education that served the wholeness of a person, an education illuminated by the polar star of moral coherence. Now, that philosophy that Campbell developed stood us well for a long time, included vocation. How do I get a paycheck? How do I manage to pay my bills? So there were 115, we may run out of soap here, 115 established in this period of 1840 to 1866. 83 of them were localized in uncoordinated private high schools called institutes, academies, and seminars. But their contributions to the literacy of the members of the movement it can't be enumerated. Those who survived gradually transitioned to either 2- or 4-year colleges. The mortality rate for those new schools during this period of time was an overwhelming 80%. Now, we will look at the development of some colleges a little bit later, around the early 1900s, that involved Texas Christian and Abilene Christian, and the number of schools there that failed is also an overwhelming number. So from 1866 to 1900, the Civil War was a watershed for American higher education, separating the small sectarian college from the large public institution. Post-Civil War industrial boom spawned the rise of the university, demands again for vocational needs driven by capital economy. These colleges, which became public institutions, were founded by wealthy industrialists rather than clergy. See, it was a clergy who started these schools in the Yales and the Harvards and the Stanfords, well, not the Stanfords, but and the Princetons of the world. Stanford was started by Leland Stanford Jr., whose name you will recall is part of the Transcontinental Railroad. There were 2 companies building this way, and Stanford was coming from the west. He was a robber baron, a ruthless guy. He had built himself a lot of money, and they had a son, 12-year-old son, who died of a disease that nobody expected. And Stanford in the late 1800s was what they'd call the nouveau riche. He had a lot of money, but he didn't know how the wealthy of old money behaved. And so his dress was, I'm trying to think. Many of you will remember us, many of us will remember it was a musical band, and I'm trying to think of a word to describe them. Spike Jones. He wore a zoot suit and he had horns and all that sort of thing. Grand musicians, but people of culture and people who were refined and knew how to set a table in which fork to pick up were not impressed. And I was growing up in West Tennessee. There was a country band called Dusty Rhodes, and he had one of his brothers was on there, and he wore a blackout on his teeth, and he had one of these Chad plaid suits and a stupid hat, and he was a clown of that kind of thing. Well, wealthy industrialists were starting schools, and they wanted to be able to produce somebody who could come work in their factories. So the Stone Campbell movement, while all this is going on, was not being idle. From 1867 to 1899, into the Civil War, well, just past the Civil War to the end of the century, there were 79 colleges and 74 academic institutes. That's 150. Impoverished by war, this is us in the South. Impoverished by war, missing a generation of college-age youth who had died in the battlefield, the South was unable to respond to educational reforms that were taking place in the North. That war and the fact that we were an agrarian society, and in New England, the Industrial Revolution in 1789 came along and factories were there, that war lingered with us until the 30s. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, I don't care what you think about Roosevelt, during the Depression, he was able to get started things like the TVA, which brought in flood control, recreation, electricity. Frida says she can remember, she grew up in Coble, down on the Duck River in Hickman County, and she says she remembers when they got electricity. I remember when we got a telephone. Our phone number was 29, and if you wanted to talk to somebody, you picked up the phone, you said, "Hello, Central," and give me whoever. But that's a digression. We in the South were victims of the changes that were made and needed to be made, and it's been in the last 75 to 100 years, somebody who, I should have thought of this before, but somebody who can point to the date that Atlanta began to become a powerhouse would show when we began to become not the redheaded stepchild anymore. Colleges in the South were closely held to classical curriculums, did not embrace the elective system, other needed reforms, and vocational ideas. There were 15 attempts, think about this, 15 attempts between 1868 and 1950 to establish schools for African Americans. The lone success story is Southwest Christian College in Texas. So here is the example I want to talk to you about with regard to Abilene Christian. We've discussed divisions in the quarter earlier that plagued the Stone-Campbell movement. Stone and Campbell got to thinking they were alike in 1831. They joined forces. After a while, they went their separate ways. We had the Missionary Society, about which Nelson talked. We had the concept of instrumental music. In later years, we had premillennialism. 23 colleges were founded in Texas between 1865 and 1929. So end of the Civil War, till 1929, when the stock market crash came, there were 23 colleges, 12 by Churches of Christ, 11 by the Disciples. Church of Christ colleges tended to last 10 years, while Disciples of Christ lasted on average 22 years. 3 remain today: Abilene Christian with us, Texas Christian with the Disciples, and Jarvis Christian, about which I know very little. The rest of this story is the excessive number of schools born out of the theological rivalry spread resources of movement too thin. These rivalries must be recognized as a major factor in their failures. Controversy over theological orthodoxy of college presidents suggested that faith had begun to supersede knowledge. After the Civil War, they were far more anxious about orthodoxy than before. So, an example, the Gospel Advocate, Topper Fanning and David Lipscomb started. It had to cease publication during the war. They started up again afterward. You'll remember that Neil Anderson, who owned and published and edited the Gospel Advocate, was here with us 3 weeks ago. Neil talked about how Firm Foundation was started as a competitor to the Gospel Advocate. Another paper that was started was called the Gospel Guardian. E.L. Jorgensen came out with Great Songs of the Church, which was just an excellent hymnal. Well, Jorgensen was associated with people who believe that Christ is coming again and going to reign on the earth 1,000 years. They call that premillennialism. And people took strong stands on that. You had to decide whether or not you thought people were going to heaven if they believed in those things. And so a fellow named Foy E. Wallace Jr., who was editor of the Gospel Advocate for a while, made it his mission to destroy Jorgensen and ruin the Great Songs of the Church. He had a dilatory impact, but he didn't bring it down completely. So 20th century assessment of Christian colleges, Bill Humble, in his book that Nelson and I sort of used as a framework from starting, pointed out in about a page and a half, he said in the 30s and 40s, 50s, we just tried to start too many colleges. Now, when we get around to talking about Christian higher education in the Northeast, I'll be able to demonstrate that to you up close and personal. I was there. We just tried to start too many. By 1940, 5 colleges had survived in Churches of Christ. David Lipscomb was started in 1891. It was called National Bible School to begin with. He wouldn't let them name it after him until after he died, and the board changed the name of it David Lipscomb College. Freed-Hardeman was started in 1908. Now, I put 1869 up there because I mentioned earlier that there were predecessor institutions that led up to that being started, and I think in the 70s, leadership there got to doing some research, and they decided they could claim that they went all the way back to 1869. I grew up thinking it was 1908. Abilene Christian was started in 1906. Now, 1906, you will recall, is the date when the census actually recognized the split between disciples and Christian church. That had taken place over the Missionary Society and instruments and all that. That was unfolding between the end of the Civil War and 1906, when that 1900 census was reported. That's when they became 3. So Abilene Christian was started with these other schools that we talked about that didn't make it. Harding was started in 1924 as a merger of a school in Kansas and a school in Marlton, Arkansas. And then they had an opportunity to move to Searcy in 1934. Now, Harding was on the verge of failure, and they brought George Benson home from China. He was a missionary in China for years and years and years. And they brought George Benson home with the purpose of closing the school. Benson wasn't going to let that happen. Freed and I attended Harding after Freed-Hardeman, and the story about Dr. Benson was he would go around taking brooms. If he saw a broom standing somewhere and the bristles were on the ground, he'd turn it up this way so he'd get a few more sweeps out of it. I mean, he was just militant about saving things, and he hitched the school to ultra-conservatism and was able to finance it by doing that. You may recall that Harding got burned just a little bit because there was a man, I think his name is Philbrick, who was a person who had been a communist and turned to the United States, but he was actually a counter-spy and really was still a communist. Benson was able to, he started something called a National Education Institute on the campus, which brought conservatives from all over, and they were able to fund the school that way. Pepperdine was started in 1937 by George Pepperdine. Now, George Pepperdine made his fortune as owner of Western Auto Stores. They haven't been around for a long time, but I can remember in Henderson there was a Western Auto Store, which was a predecessor to AutoZone and stores like that were mainly automotive things. And Pepperdine gave his fortune to start the school. He did not, now with Lipscomb and Harding and Abilene and Harding, Bible classes were required in various ways. Not the same application, but they were required students to take. Pepperdine did not, he had Bible classes offered, but he did not make that as a requirement for students. Pepperdine was on the verge of failure in 1957, and Norval Young, who had been, and J.P. Sanders, both of whom were heavily involved as faculty members at Lipscomb. Norval Young went out there and took J.P. Sanders with him, and they were able to save the school. Young was a great entrepreneur. He hitched Pepperdine to a lot of rich countries, rich Asian countries, and was able to get access to their kings and queens, and a lot of money came. They were able to move in the Watts time. Pepperdine was in that area, in that Watts area, and there were, this is in the 60s, and there were riots. It was just all around the campus. The place was burning, just like the Rodney King time later, same area. and Pepperdine Young was able to reach people like the Firestones. Other company names became involved with them, and they were able to purchase land in Malibu in 1973, move the campus out there. Pepperdine, being on the West Coast, and the church not as strong there, never had, as I understand it, quite as high a percentage of Church of Christ membership as some of the other schools, but still associated with Churches of Christ. Additional colleges that started in the 20th century. Oklahoma Christian was started in 1950. Now, my grandfather was born in Yorkville, Tennessee, and he was a high school principal in Bells, Tennessee. And in 1919, A.B. Lipscomb, who had become president of Lipscomb in 1913, H. Leo Bowles was president, and board didn't like him for some reason, and so they just told him his contract wasn't going to be renewed. So A.B. Lipscomb invited G.C. Brewer and my grandfather to come and teach in the English department. So my grandfather was there until 1923. Freed and Hardeman had started their school, and those two guys just got to fighting so hard that they got to where they wouldn't speak to each other. And so the governing board said, we can't have this. And they tried pretty hard to get them to reconcile, and it just didn't work out. And so the governing board said, okay, you two guys have to go somewhere else. You can't be here anymore. So A.G. Freed came to Lipscomb and became vice president over the campus school. He never went back to Henderson, except he would come. Some people say that they would come and visit the grave of his son. He never went back on the campus. Hardeman was a very popular preacher. He was holding his tabernacle sermons in the Ryman Auditorium. Hardeman never left. He would preaching, went on a tour around the world. And so C.P. Rowland and my grandfather were president of the school. They got it to be accredited while they were doing it, just maintained. Well, on New Year's Day, 1925, Hardeman has Hall C. Calhoun lined up. Now, Hall C. Calhoun, PhD from Harvard, and he wound up being involved in other Christian schools along the way. So he gets the board together and says, we think we'd like to do some things here, and my grandfather and Brother Rowland are in the board meeting, and they proposed that for Hardeman to take over and be president again. And so they said, well, Brother Rowland, Brother Hall, what do you think about that? And they said, well, whatever's good for the school, that'll be fine. So my granddad then was invited to become Cordell Christian to be president out there in Oklahoma. And he was going to take Rowland with him. Well, Hardeman finds out about this, and he says, wait a minute, I need you guys to stay here. You can't. My granddad says, I have already signed. I can't back out. Rowland hadn't signed yet, so he stayed. Grandpa was president for 2 years. Middle of the Depression, he said, you guys have to let me out. I can't do this. And so they agreed to let him resign if he'd still raise money for them. So he became minister at Altus, Oklahoma. And then Hardeman was out in there, and 10 years later, in 1933, holding meetings somewhere. And he called my granddad up and said, if you ever come back to Freed Hardeman, you need to come down. At 50 years old, he went back, spent the rest of his career there. While he was at Altus preaching, L.C. Sears, who was the chief academic officer at Harding, contacted him, asking him to come there and be chair of the English department. What I'm saying to you is, I couldn't get it on the screen, I won't be able to show it, but I made a list just off the top of my head of 50 people who have been influential in my lifetime in our Christian education, and they have been involved one way or another multiple times with our schools. So my granddad was involved first with Lipscomb, Freed Hardeman, Cordell Christian, which became Oklahoma Christian, then back to Freed-Hardeman. J.N. Armstrong, that name is heavily associated with Harding. He was at Lipscomb early on. James Baird wound up being president of Oklahoma Christian when it started in 1950. Our Norris brother was chief academic officer at Oklahoma Christian for a long time. He was very much interested in technological advances. They were ahead of the curve in the 50s and 60s on high-tech stuff. Lubbock Christian was started in 1957 by F.W. Maddox, who was a friend of Norval Young. It was a 2-year school. Later, it became a 4-year school. York College was started in 1890. It continues today. It's in York, Nebraska. Continues today. It has 600 students. They're struggling. Alabama Christian was started in 1942. Later, it became Faulkner University. Faulkner was a governor of Alabama. When Freed and I were in school at Harding in 1963, they were having a big fundraising effort in Montgomery at the Civic Center there, and so they invited Harding Bells and Bows, of which I was a member, to come over, and we were going over on the bus, and we get to Selma, Alabama, and the universal joint on the bus goes out. Now this is right in the middle of all of those freedom rides. And we spend the night on the side of the road in Selma, Alabama, not sleeping very much at all. Nothing happened to us. They sent a charter bus for us the next day, and Uncle Greg, the bus driver, stayed with it and got it fixed. But that was just part of it. George DeHoff, who was supposed to become president of Freed-Hardeman after N.B. Hardeman, but that didn't work out, and he moved to Murfreesboro. He published had a publishing house, published a lot of books, started a college, Magic Valley Christian College in Idaho. Now, you talk about critical mass, they surely don't have it in Church of Christ out there. Columbia Christian was started in 1956 in Portland, Oregon. They began to fail. They were taken under the wing of Oklahoma Christian College as a satellite called Cascade College, and that lasted a couple of years and they closed. Florida College was started from one of our spats. In the late 40s and early 50s, we began to be anxious about orphans' homes, cooperation, all those kinds of things. And so Florida College was started, I think, in Temple Terrace, Florida in 1946 by L.R. Wilson. They were generally non-cooperation people. And I've read from their website last night, Florida College now draws its staff and faculty, majority of its students from non-institutional Churches of Christ. We are not as militant about that as we were in the 50s. I mean, you know, I've heard preachers, Church of Christ preachers condemn each other to hell because they couldn't agree on whether or not it was okay to have an orphan's home or support a college or those cooperative activities, which go back to the same conflict as we had with regard to missionary societies. New colleges from 1900 to 1920, 54 new institutions. By the way, I need somebody to tell me, it looks to me like I've got about 3 or 4 minutes. When the first bell rings, let me know. Frida told me last time, has it already rung? Ouch. Okay. These are the 4 things that I wanted you to get from that. Bible study in general is an integral part of educational curriculum. Pioneering of coeducational and female education, establishment of Bible chairs, divinity houses, and schools of religion in public institutions, and development of campus ministries on the university campuses. There are schools of preaching and Bible colleges where primarily they are for adults who are leaving another career and want to begin to preach. They don't have any educational courses. It's all Bible, and there are a bunch of those. 33 of them now in the United States. generally adults. Dr. George Benson, president of Harding, some guy came to him and said, Dr. Benson, I need you to let me not take all these English and math and history courses and all that sort of thing. And Dr. Benson had a unique way of speaking, and he said, young man, do you want to be a pine tree or do you want to be an oak? He said, a pine tree, it grows fast and it's cut down easily, but the oak tree is strong and it takes a long time to grow. So the young man got the point. Has the other bell rung yet? Okay, I'll get started on this. Christian education in the Northeast, World War II's over. Guys come home, a lot of them wind up in corporate jobs in the Northeast, and they decide they need a school. In 1955 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, there's a gathering. All the Christian college presidents come. They meet for a weekend, and the discussion is whether or not we can have a college in the Northeast. The outcome of it was, yes, we need a college in the Northeast, but just start one. So they went home, and they started 3. Ohio Valley, Parkersburg, West Virginia, Michigan Christian, it's now Rochester College, Northeastern Christian Institute, merged with Ohio Valley in 1954. They opened, I got that wrong, it's 1959. So Northeastern Christian, where Frida and I worked for about 4 years in the late 80s, opened in 1959. They had 10 students, 10 faculty members, and they missed payroll first month. In 1987, there were 30,000 members of the Church of Christ in Davidson County, Nashville. In 1987, from Virginia, all Atlantic coast states to Maine, there were 18,000 members of the Churches of Christ. There simply wasn't enough critical mass for us to sustain ourselves. I knew enough about higher education. I'd spent 7 years in Washington, D.C., working for an educational association. I knew in order for a small residential church-related college to survive, you needed 1,100 residential students. I knew that. Northeastern had 125. I was 45 years old. I hadn't yet learned I couldn't do everything I set out to do. I said, Lord, let's try to do it together. It just wasn't to be. So these are the things I've just related to you. And this is so I am so appreciative of your sitting with me through this, about which my life is passionate. We're dismissed. Any questions? We're dismissed. Thank you. I'll go out to my car and get that